afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Mullen, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Managing the Rapidly Changing World of eBooks, Research on Usage, Access, and Acquisition, sponsored by ProQuest. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. Along the left-hand side, you'll see a chat panel that you can use to submit questions or comments. We'll spend some time responding to your questions during the program, so please do feel free to submit these throughout. You'll also see a separate box for technical questions. Please feel free to use this feature for any technical difficulties you may be experiencing, so our production team can troubleshoot them privately. And finally, please note that today's program will be recorded and all registrants will receive follow-up instructions on accessing the archived version. Our speakers today are Michael Levine-Clark, Interim Dean and Director, the University of Denver Libraries, and Jane Burke, Vice President of Market Development at ProQuest. At this point, we're all ready to start, so over to you, Michael.
Great, thank you, and thanks everybody for coming out today. I've given this presentation a variety of times, and I'm figuring out how to give it better each time. I think I'm learning more about the process of presenting this data from this massive study that I did. A couple of years ago, I was approached by ProQuest and asked to write a white paper about worldwide usage data for eBrary and EBL. eBook data from hundreds of thousands of titles and thousands of different libraries. And my first reaction was, wow, that sounds like a lot of fun. What a great opportunity. And my second, when I got the data, was, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? Because it was spreadsheets with hundreds of thousands of rows and thousands or hundreds of columns. It's a lot of data and hard to work through it and hard to make sense of. So for me, the process of making sense of that data has been a lot of fun and an interesting project. So we have data from all customers worldwide from EBL from 2013 and eBrary from 2014. So this is the usage data from those 2 years. It's aggregated by title, so I have all of the data for any given title. I don't have separate data for a particular library or a particular user. So it's all at the title level. And the data came to me in spreadsheets for the world and by region. So region meaning Africa, Asia, and so on. And each spreadsheet has one row for a title, and all of the associated data for that title is in that row. The rows of data go hundreds of columns long, and they include multiple different bits of information about the title itself, as well as information about the types of usage. And I'll talk about those types of usage in a minute. Really important are that each title has different ways of classifying it by subject, so the LC class and subclass, as well as the BISAC number, the book information, book industry number. And subject information is really important for aggregating titles into something meaningful. I also have publication year for each title, so I can look at usage by older or newer materials in those years, as well as the number of titles with the number of libraries with the title available and the number of libraries with usage. Because you could have a title that is widely available in many libraries, but most of the usage happens in one library, or the usage is spread across many of those libraries. So that's an important piece of information. And then multiple different types of usage, and I'll talk about those types of usage in a minute. In a study of this sort, in a data set of this sort, it's hardly surprising that there would be some data snags. Probably fundamentally important, the EBL and eBrary data weren't merged at this point, so I couldn't combine them in any way. I had to look at EBL and eBrary separately, and we had data from multiple different years, and we decided to do eBrary for 2014 and EBL for 2013, and that was entirely an arbitrary decision. We could have looked at both years at once, but it seemed useful to look at 2 different years and see if maybe there were any differences. We have also thought about looking across multiple years, and we'll probably do that in the future. The call numbers were a big problem. In many cases, a title had a missing call number, and in cases where there was no call number assigned to it whatsoever, I didn't bother to use that call number, right? So a call number being not present meant that I just ignored that title in terms of categorizing it by subject. In many cases, though, there were errors in the call numbers, and these errors tended to have to follow similar patterns, and I was able to correct these errors by identifying the patterns and then doing batch changes. So one example would be, in a lot of cases, there was a stray character before the call number. Sometimes it was an easy to remove one in the case of a lowercase x, which doesn't appear at the beginning of a Library of Congress call number. Sometimes it was harder to identify, like an uppercase B at the case in this example of B before BF, so that we were able to I had to go through and manually identify those and then remove those. I think I identified most of those cases, but I'm sure I didn't identify all of them. But I think it was enough to build a meaningful set with some subject categorization. It's also, I think, really important to note that it's not easy. In fact, it's impossible to build a perfect retrospective list of titles that were available to a library at a particular time. So I can say this particular title was available to this particular library right now when we built the data set. I can say that this particular title was available throughout the time period that we studied and therefore was likely to be available to that library. But I can't say with 100% certainty that that library had that title available at that particular time. We used a pretty well-educated guess to build the list of titles that were available for a library, and certainly in the case when we had usage data associated with that library, we knew for sure that that library had that title available, but it's not perfect. So it's close enough, I think, to get a pretty good sense. In terms of what to do with the data, I started this study, and then I had this thought, well, what's the point? What's the point of looking at usage on such a broad scale? All of our institutions are unique. All of us have particular issues with our curriculum, with our research, and with our other collection material. So for instance, a library that it has a STEM focus is going to have a different usage pattern than a library with a general liberal arts focus. A library with a really large monograph collection is going to have a very different pattern of usage than a library that has a relatively small collection where the eBrary books, for instance, are a significant portion of their collection. All of that, I think, is true. All of that, I think, is reason why it makes sense to do this sort of study at the local level as well. But I also think that aggregating across all of these institutions worldwide gives us some data that can be used for benchmarking. It allows us to get a sense of what general patterns might be, and then we can compare against them and see how we compare locally. As I mentioned, there are multiple different ways of looking at usage, and all of these factored into how we looked at the usage within the white paper. At the very basic level is a session, and a session is any time that a user interacts with an eBook. So you start the process of looking at the book, and a session is recorded. And really, no use can happen without a session. But all of these other types of usages can follow from a session. A page view is a count of the number of pages examined within a session. So there can be many page views within a single session. A download is a download of the entire book, and there's also in eBury there's the measure of a chapter download in some cases as well. And sometimes a download can happen with no pages viewed. Sometimes a download can happen after pages have been viewed. Usage time records the amount of time in the book, so how long somebody spent reading that book. And then copies or copying and pasting, and prints is the number of pages that are printed. When we have a number for copies, it's the number of pages that had a copy or paste on that page. So together we have a pretty robust set of measures of usage, certainly more robust than simply a session, which just tells us that that book got used or not. In order to do some categorization, I used the LC classes for most of the work, but I also broke things down into arts and humanities, social sciences, and STEM. And you can see here how I broke it down from the LC classes. LC classes certainly don't break down perfectly into arts and humanities, social sciences, and STEM, and so there were some cases where I pulled subclasses out. TR photography is one, BF psychology is another. And there were a few that just didn't categorize well, and I left them out entirely when looking at these broad categories. So how do you take all the data and make sense of it? How do you tell a story? Across the world, there were about 600,000 titles available, or over 600,000 titles available in eBury to at least one library. And at least one library in North America had almost every single one of these titles. And this went down to South Asia, where at least there were about 140,000 titles that were available in at least one library. So we're talking about a really large data set for eBury, and an almost as large data set for EBL. When you look at them by LC class, and this is eBury and EBL, the H's for social sciences are by far the largest LC class, as they are in most of our libraries, and as they are for eBury and for EBL. Not surprising. PQ, so languages and literature and sciences, are the next highest in both, although you can see, looking at EBL and eBury separately, that the order of these is different. So the overall patterns are fairly similar, but there are some differences in terms of subject breakdown of the titles available within these packages. It's important to note Academic Complete. Academic Complete is the large subscription package that's available from eBury, and it's about 125,000 titles. And this same exact package is available at about 2,000 libraries worldwide. It's important to note because this obviously is going to skew the data in some way if 2,000 libraries have exactly the same pool of titles, and other titles are available in fewer libraries. This has a big impact on the eBury data, and I'll talk about that as we go through. Just for example, here's a breakdown of how these two sets complete. So eBury overall, about 30% of the titles are in STEM, about 28% or 29% are arts and humanities, and about 29% are social sciences. You can see that a much higher portion of the titles in the Academic Complete collection are in the arts and humanities, and a smaller portion are in the STEM discipline. So there is a very big difference in the makeup of these two, of the Academic Complete package versus all of eBury. So this next set of slides compare usage versus titles available. In an ideal world where every title was used exactly as you would predict, the usage levels would be exactly the same as what's available. And that's not the case as we go through this. So these are eBury versus EBL compared to each other. You can see that they are pretty similar. some slight differences, but overall, the general breakdown between the subject areas, these broad subject categories, is pretty similar. The number of titles available in eBury worldwide, or number of libraries with a title available, I'm sorry. So on average for eBury, about 400 libraries have each title. Some titles are only available in a handful of libraries. Some titles are available in thousands of libraries, but on average, it's about 400 libraries. The average number of libraries with a title available, you can see that for eBury, it's most in the arts and humanities, and this is directly related to Academic Complete. So remember, Academic Complete is skewed towards arts and humanities. It's available in 2,000 plus libraries. So on average, arts and humanities titles are available in more libraries for eBury than the other disciplines, and STEM are available in the fewest. EBL is different, and EBL doesn't have that standard package that everybody has, and when libraries are choosing either a pool of titles through DDA or are selecting title by title, they tend to be selecting more social science titles, or social science titles get selected across more libraries, which is interesting. Worldwide for eBury, about 53% of the titles were used in 2014. And again, this is 1 year. That's a really important caveat. If we looked at 2 years or 4 years or 5 years, one would predict that the percent of titles being used would go up. But over 50% of the titles were used in at least one library worldwide in 2014, and you can see the variation by region. By discipline, the highest percentage of titles were used in the social sciences, the lowest percentage in STEM. For EBL, same pattern, but higher overall percentage of use. And this again relates to the existence of Academic Complete and its presence in so many libraries. EBL titles EBL libraries tend to have fewer titles than the libraries that have that broad eBury package. So it makes sense that a higher percentage of those titles are overall. By LC class, the percentage of titles used goes from over 70% down to just over 40% for Q. The highest percentage are in E, American history, followed by M, which is music. I do think it's interesting that humanities titles are right near the top here. I think the presence of N, art history, fifth, is pretty interesting as well, that art history titles are used across, tend to be used overall higher than average. Here's a breakdown of the same data, but just by number. So the previous one was percentage. This is number of titles, and you can see that even though H wasn't at the top of the list, in terms of just the number of titles being used, it is the highest because it's the highest amount of titles overall. When you look at the same data and break it down by region of the world, so this is the percentage of titles used in those different subject areas. So overall, 63% of the social science titles in the world were used. In each of the regions, social sciences or STEM titles have a higher percentage than arts and humanities, but it varies between social sciences and STEM across these different regions. Okay, and now I'm back to the slide that I thought I was on before when I said these next set of slides looks at availability versus use. They look similar. So availability on the left is what the overall makeup of the eBury package looks like. So 30% of the eBury package is STEM, 29% is social sciences, 29% is arts and humanities, and 12% is other. When you start to look at measures of use, you can see that social sciences tends to perform higher than one would expect. So these are titles that have any session. It's 1 session, 10 sessions, 1,000 sessions. This slide doesn't take into account how many of those sessions there were. just whether a title had a session or not. And you can see that social science titles are more likely to have a session, as are arts and humanities titles then would be predicted based on their availability. When you look at the count of sessions, so how many sessions, it skews even higher towards social sciences and even further away from STEM. Social science titles are used more heavily than one would expect in terms of sessions. When we look at page views, same pattern. Social sciences are higher than one would expect. Titles with a download, interestingly, STEM is higher than one would expect. Arts and humanities lower than one would expect. But the overall numbers of downloads, STEM falls down a little below what one would expect. So that's interesting, I think. Titles with a copy-paste. Copying and pasting clearly doesn't seem to happen very often in the STEM disciplines. It happens more in social sciences and arts and humanities. And when we count the number of copies and pastes, not the titles with a copy or paste, it's even more heavily skewed towards social sciences. With printing, the same story holds true. And you can see that however, in the STEM disciplines, they actually print more pages, even though the titles that have printing aren't as high. And finally, time spent in the book, which is really, I think, on some levels, to me, one of the more interesting things to look at. That when you're looking at time spent in the book, you're talking, I think, about immersive reading. And this skews more towards social sciences and arts and humanities and very far away from STEM. So social science titles are more likely to have at least one use, but some humanities subjects are most heavily used. We saw that M and N and E were up near the top, music and art and American history. P, languages and literature, is relatively poorly used, which pulls the humanities down overall because P is a really large subject area. In general, social science titles are used above what one would predict, but the sciences are lower than you would predict. Okay, so the likelihood of high use. This is looking at titles that sort of when you think about what would happen in terms of action per session. The previous was just looking at use overall, and it wasn't really saying what happens in any given session. So this next set of slides looks at action per session. Worldwide, STEM titles have more page views per session than social sciences and then arts and humanities in that order. And that pattern holds true in just about every region of the world. So when somebody has a session in the STEM disciplines, they look at more pages, which is, I think, very interesting. In the UK and Ireland, North America, Europe, and Australia and New Zealand, followed closely by Asia Pacific, there tend to be more page views per session. In the developing world, there tend to be fewer. And I think that this really is a case of developing world versus developed world, and probably is linked to issues around availability of secure and fast and easy internet access. So you can read online versus having to download, and we'll look at download in a minute. Page use per session by LC class. I'm going to highlight a couple of subject areas within here, and one of these is F, American history. Another is T, technology, and the third is N, art history. All three of them are at the top in terms of page views per session. It is interesting to me that people look at a lot of pages in art history books per session. And we'll follow these through the next bunch of slides. Okay, now downloads per session follows the same patterns in terms of subject area worldwide as page views per session. Downloads per session happen the most in STEM. In social sciences, it's next and followed by arts and humanities. So the STEM disciplines look at more pages and they also download more. They're looking at a lot. They're not necessarily spending a lot of time, but they're looking at a lot per session. We see the developing world is a little bit higher in some areas than the developed world, and this may be the reverse of what we were seeing with more pages viewed in the developed world. That because of internet connections and secure access, they're downloading. And I think that's interesting, and we'll trace that through some more. T, technology, has the most downloads per session, and we saw that T was also really high up in terms of page views. N is right in the middle. F, American history. In fact, D, E, and F, which are all history, are down near the bottom. So downloading doesn't seem to happen in history on a per session basis. Downloading and page views happen in technology on a per session basis. Worldwide, there's far fewer copies per session in STEM disciplines. The most copying per session happens in the social sciences, followed by arts and humanities. And I don't think that there are any significant regional variations here. I think the variations that matter are just between STEM, social sciences, and arts and humanities. Copying per session, J and K, so K, law, and J, political science, are highest. And I've heard from a few people that in terms of legal research, copying and pasting is a fairly common action, so that's predicted. T, technology, is down near the bottom. D, E, and F are on the upper half. N is somewhere near the bottom as well. So people are copying and pasting in history a little more than average. They're not copying and pasting in technology at all. Okay, printing per session. Just as there are a lot of page views and downloads, there's a lot of printing. So it seems that people are doing whatever they can to look at a lot of content in STEM disciplines worldwide. They're printing a lot of pages. They're looking at a lot of pages, and they're downloading. But they're not copying and pasting in any significant way. They're not doing a lot on those pages. They're looking at a lot of pages. I, again, don't think that there are any really interesting or important differences in terms of regional variation, although there may be a little bit of that developing versus developed world going on here. Printing per session by LC class. E and F are down near the bottom again, as is D. So history, they're not printing a lot, but they are reading a lot of pages. T, technology, is up near the top. N is in the middle, art history. And then finally, time per session. And when we compare this to all of what we've looked at before, I think this is really fascinating. So STEM disciplines worldwide spend the least amount of time in the book per session. Arts and humanities spend the most amount of time in the book per session. And so what this says is that in the STEM disciplines, they're looking at a lot of pages, they're downloading a lot, but they're doing it fairly quickly relative to people in the arts and humanities who perhaps are doing immersive reading in eBooks. And here we have history right at the top. So D, E, and F are right up at the top. They're spending a lot of time reading history books per session. T, technology, is down near the bottom, as is N, art history. So in these areas, they're looking at a lot of pages, but they seem to be flipping through, figuratively, or metaphorically speaking, I guess. They're flipping through a lot of pages relatively quickly. I think this is interesting, and it seems to suggest that there is some immersive reading happening, and that some of the patterns by discipline are really different, and that you could trace through any number of these, as I've just done a handful as we went through these. So just some conclusions from this section. The views per session are lowest in the developing world, the page views per session. Their highest downloads per session are highest in the developing world. And I do think that there is a link there. The page views and downloads per session and printing per session are highest for STEM. There seems to be a need to look at a lot of pages in whatever form. And yet, in terms of time, it's shortest in STEM, longest in the arts and humanities, and shorter in the developing world. Again, linked probably to that need to get offline. Okay, now looking at just the most heavily used titles. So the top 10% of titles worldwide with sessions. There were about 640,000 titles overall. So the top 10,000 are about 64,000 titles. These titles have a lot of sessions. So they all have at least 75 sessions worldwide. They account for 81% of all sessions worldwide. That's a lot of action happening in the top 10% of titles. In some parts of the world, in Africa, over 90% of the sessions occur within the top 10% of titles, and it's above 70% across the entire world. This, I think, is interesting. So when you look at the overall availability down at the bottom, the STEM titles are about 30%, social sciences titles about 29%, arts and humanities about 29%. Yet within the top 10% of titles, 37% of the titles within the top 10% of the titles used are in the social sciences, 41% of the sessions. STEM titles and STEM sessions are underrepresented from what one would expect. Arts and humanities titles are a little overrepresented from what you would expect, but they have fewer sessions than you would expect. Of the sessions overall, in the social sciences, so 83% of the sessions in social science overall occur in these top 10% of titles worldwide. 81% occur in STEM. 77% occur in arts and humanities. So there's I think a longer tail here in terms of usage in the arts and humanities. So of the sessions over the entire world, the smallest percentage happen in the top 10% for the humanities. Here's a regional variation. In general, across the world, it's social sciences, but there's some variation in some parts of the world. It's STEM. So some conclusions about these top 10% of titles. So they represent more than 70% of sessions worldwide. They actually represent 80% on average, but in every region of the world, they represent at least 70% of sessions. Social sciences are more heavily represented than in the data set as a whole. And arts and humanities titles are more heavily represented, but account for fewer sessions than would be expected. So there's some deeper usage spread across arts and humanities. And I'm noticing a question about what percentage of the top 10% of titles are in academic complete, and I don't actually know that. When we built the data set, I don't have usage data for academic complete. I have a broad look at the shape of academic complete, but I don't have usage data or even a way to compare it directly. And we're hoping to build that in as we go forward, but we don't have that now. But it's a really great question. So next quick comparison is intensive versus extensive use. And when you think about usage on a subject level, you could say, I'm really happy because a lot of the titles get used, or you could say, I'm really happy because there's really heavy use for some titles. Either would make me happy, I think. And the sweet spot is when you have a subject area where there's both broad and deep. So narrow to broad is looking at the percentage of titles used, and deep to shallow is looking at the average amount of use in that subject area overall. So here's a way to look at that. And this is for EBL. I've got in the white paper, we have separate slides for eBrary and EBL in this case. N and L, and R and H. So L is education, N is art history, R is medicine, and H is social sciences. And these are subject areas that have both broad and deep usage. So across, there are a lot of titles used, and those titles tend to get used really heavily. In the other opposite quadrant, where you don't really want to be, we have F, American history, U, V, and K. So U and V are military and naval history, and K is law. F was interesting because it tended to be at the top in terms of page views per session, but across the whole bulk of titles, there's both relatively low use and relatively few titles used. But when they're used pretty heavily. Here's page views. So the previous one was sessions, this is page views, and you can see that L and N and R are still up in that upper quadrant. U, V, F, and K are in that lower quadrant. And again, when you look at the white paper, you can spend more time looking at these differences. But I do think it's an interesting way of mapping things out. And here's everything combined for EBL. So sessions and views and downloads and copies and prints. And what we see is that some of the things that were appearing to be doing pretty well in some of these other measures maybe don't do as well in this measure. So E and F are in that lower left low quadrant, and they were not. They were in some cases really high in the page views per session, for instance, and in the time per session. L didn't really appear anywhere significantly in those views, but is always in this upper quadrant. And art history is as well. And I do think it's interesting that art books tend to get used a lot, and they tend to get used heavily. And that flies in the face of everything I've heard from art historians who say we really don't want to use ebooks. Okay, one last measure of use is usage by year of publication. And this is just a look at the titles available across eBrary in 2014. Not surprisingly, most of them were published in the last decade or so. There's not a huge difference across disciplines, but it's interesting that there's not a spike in arts and humanities titles available as we get into older years. And in fact, from the 50s or the 60s through about the 90s, there are more STEM titles available than anything else. Just looking at the most recent 15 years, these are the titles that were available in 2014. There's a variation by year in terms of the most commonly available subject areas. Not like the most recent titles are STEM, and as we get older, there are more arts and humanities titles available. Nor, in fact, does usage follow that pattern. So across the 15 years, the titles with a session, social sciences are at the top across almost that whole period. Arts and humanities and STEM sort of trade places in terms of titles with a session. And then the number of sessions, again, arts and humanities and STEM trade places as we go back and forth. It's not the case that newer titles, or STEM titles are used more heavily as they're newer and drop off as they get older. And in fact, this chart maybe makes you think that that's what's happening, but if you go back 5 or more years, that STEM line starts to increase again. So some conclusions from here. Certainly one size does not fit all. In the arts and humanities, they spend the most amount of time in the book. In the social sciences, they use the highest percentage of titles overall and have an even higher percentage of overall sessions. STEM has the most page views per session and the most downloads per session, but seem to spend the least amount of time in the book. There are obviously a bunch of different important regional variations as well. So I think it's crucial that we don't rely on a single measure of use. We should be comparing multiple factors because some of these measures of use make some subject areas look great and others make them look less great. It's really important to, I think, look at many measures of use. And that's true whether you're looking at this locally or on a broad worldwide scale. So I also think it's important to think a little bit more broadly about our ebook collections after this. All subjects do get used. Publication date doesn't appear to be that important a factor. It seems to me that we should be buying older ebook collections in many cases, and that we should be thinking as broadly as possible about subject coverage within our ebook collection if we haven't already done so. There is much more data and many more charts in the white paper, which is available on this website, and we'll send this out to you afterwards, or make this available to you afterwards, so you don't have to quickly write this down if you don't want to. And there's also an article available in Insights, UKSG journal as well. So there's plenty more that you can read. But I'm now going to turn it over to Jane, who's going to talk a little bit about some ways of accessing eBooks.
Thanks, Michael. So what I wanted to do in just a few minutes here is address dealing with this incredibly growing piece of our collections. How is it that you can actually manage these large amounts of eBooks, whether you're talking by discipline, whether you're talking by age, whatever? And so I just wanted to tell you a little bit about a solution that we've come up with at ProQuest as an example of the way in which we're trying to respond to this huge growing portion of your collection. You know, Interim, which is our collection management solution, is really designed to manage complexity in a much easier way than the traditional management solutions commonly known as ILSs out there in the world. And, you know, the basics of Interim are, Interim is meant to support the life cycle of all acquisitions models and all types of resources. It's meant to integrate support for those models and content types into the library's current workflow in a more efficient way than is currently possible with some older technologies. It's meant to reduce staff workload and time, and most importantly, it's meant to make these things available to end users as quickly as possible. The reason that we have addressed some interesting ways of making eBooks more straightforward in the workflows is really that last point. The sooner that we can expose, say, the DDA pool to end users, the faster end users can discover and utilize such things. And so that was kind of our basis here for a set of capabilities that we released a little bit more than a year ago. So, you know, the DDA lifecycle is one that I think is increasingly adopted. Michael's usage data doesn't really address that directly in the sense of, were these titles that were in a DDA selection pool, sometimes known as PDA, or were they titles that had been committed to by the library? I'm sure that's one of the things that, you know, he's looking at. But if you look at the DDA life cycle, which last year grew an enormous % in terms of libraries adopting it, you see that there are really sort of 3 stages, but all really interact with one another. So the library creates a set of criteria for the DDA pool. That DDA pool needs to be managed. That DDA pool needs to be made discoverable. And then that DDA pool, or the titles within that pool, need to be evaluated. What librarians were telling us was that the process of managing, making discoverable, and assessing was very, very time-consuming and difficult. And for me, when I listened, what I heard was also very batch-oriented, that there was a lot of stuff that just brought delays into the process because of the way in which the current collection technologies in libraries cause these things to have to be handled. And so what we've done is in Interim is really try to address that a bit. So we created in Interim a fully automated process for managing the DDA selection pools. What do I mean when I say fully automated? I mean fully automated, hands-off for the library, and to say something maybe even a bit more controversial, one that does not require the loading of MARC records into your local system. Our process is based on the fact that at ProQuest, we have a large, updated everyday knowledge base, and that large knowledge base includes literally 17 million eBooks. We get eBooks from more than 30 suppliers. We get those eBook records. We load them every day into the knowledge base. And so the records are there in the central knowledge base. And what we did around that was create an automated process that triggers them for an individual library based on title lists supplied by your eBook suppliers. So we've kind of taken manual action by library staff out of the process as a way of getting these things into the system and available to your end users just as quickly as we possibly could. So what you see here is just kind of a list of how we made this available. We created an API, and that API allows an eBook supplier to send us simply a list of identifiers for the titles in your selection pool. So once you create your selection pool with the eBook provider for your DDA program, they can just send us a list of the titles. We accept that into our system and use that to trigger in both the e-resource management application, the ERM, and the discovery and linking application that you actually have this title as a DDA title. Going in, we match it against the knowledge base so that we're using the most complete record that we have, regardless of which ISBN we get, because we have the access to the ISBN trees, and we can actually match to a full description even if the supplier sends us, you know, say the 10-digit ISBN instead of the 13, et cetera. We automate the activation in discovery and link, and when the status of a title changes in the DDA pool, so for example, a title gets purchased, triggered for purchase, we actually change the status in the ERM on behalf of the library. So this is a fully automated process that really allows titles to be managed much more easily and discovered much more quickly. So here's kind of a comparison. This first slide is without our solution. You know, in most systems today, how does it work? The library creates the DDA list with the eBook supplier, goes through a whole duplicate checking process. The eBook supplier sends the library MARC records. The library goes through a process in their ILS of that MARC upload. As titles get purchased, staff have to deal with changing the status of those titles on a manual basis. And should the funds expire, they have to go through a whole process of either suppressing or removing the titles. What we've done instead is the DDA list gets created at the supplier. Our API is used by the supplier to send us that list directly. A word you might use is claim. We claim the title on behalf of the library. Anyway, we activate the title on behalf of the library. And we set it to a status of being in the pool but not yet purchased. When purchase is triggered, we get an update directly from the supplier through the API. We change the status automatically. We make the title a permanent part of the collection. And we handle the invoicing in such a way that we can reduce some of the manual effort associated with that as well. So you can see that in this workflow, the library is never dealing with batches of MARC records. It's never having the delays or, frankly, the temptation to edit those MARC records, I will say that. And so we've really kind of gotten rid of the whole MARC record round-tripping process. There's a lot of details on this slide that's meant to back up what I just said. Let me just touch on a couple of them. In order to facilitate this, we have developed an API that we make available to all eBook suppliers in the industry. Obviously, we have this in place and proven with eBrary and EBL. We are in active discussions with a number of other ebook suppliers because we're very anxious on behalf of the library to be able to have this available for as many suppliers as possible. Data going into our knowledge base is updated every day, and so we get new ebook records and we're able to process the supplier listings on a daily basis. As I said, we do the updates every day, and we have a variety of data points so that when someone is looking at the ERM and trying to tell something about the status of an individual title, we actually provide a number of different statuses. So it might be shown as DDA before it gets triggered for purchase, but after it gets triggered for purchase, not only do we show it as owned, but we show the model under which it was purchased. So that helps you evaluate as you're looking at changing models within a particular supplier. And there is a full set of reports available through Intoda Assessment to allow you to sort of take a look at how that pool is actually doing. This pretty much is a repetition of everything I just said, but I really wanted to organize it for you so you can see that we built this particular solution by first working on some fundamentals and by making sure that we had the data available in the knowledge base. Doesn't do us any good to have fundamentals if we don't have the data for the individual titles. And so both of these things work together to create an integrated solution, and one that we believe and that our customers are telling us actually offers some good capabilities here. So I went and checked with our service organization. We have 95 customers who have actually put this into full production. We're hearing good things from them. And you know, I think we've got something here which is an indication not only of how we're trying to respond to your growing body of ebooks, but also the kinds of things we're looking to achieve with Intoda overall. Just want to highlight for you that this is about both reduced manual effort and about making ebooks discoverable just as quickly as possible. Now I think we're at the point of dealing with all these questions. I'm not quite sure who should go first or how we should deal with that. Maybe, Michael, if you want to go through and address any that are still outstanding from your session, then I'll come back and pick up any others that are there.
Sure, I'll do that. I guess there's one question that just came in. How did you calculate the most used titles? I know you use titles with 75 sessions or more, but how did you draw the line? I actually used the top 10% of titles, and they happen to be the titles. They happen to all have 75 sessions or more. So obviously I couldn't do exactly the top 10%, but there were about 640,000 titles overall, and getting as close to 10% of those titles as possible with titles with 75 sessions or more. So it was just the top 10% of titles with a session.
Mike, there's another question for you. I don't know if you answered this in the chat. And people, to make you aware, Michael has been answering some of your questions in the chat, so we won't repeat those questions. What are the factors affecting downloads and use variations worldwide?
So I think I talked a little bit about some of that, but I do think that there's some indication that it has to do with internet availability and sort of general connectivity and I found some reports from I can't remember what they're called, some government, some IGO that talked about teleconnectivity worldwide, and there are absolutely differences in terms of the availability of secure and fast internet connections between the developing world and the developed world. And I think that the page views, the time, and the downloads, and probably the printing are all directly related to that.
Okay, here's a question for you, Jane. If we are still maintaining our OPAC, how do we get the ebook information from our discovery layer into our OPAC?
No, I'm afraid I don't have any magic for that one. you know, the way that OPACs and the legacy ILSs work is that would in fact be a batch load of MARC records. And I have to admit that here at ProQuest, we still maintain our MARC record service specifically for those kinds of situations.
Okay. Michael, here's an initial question that came in early in the session. Why did you look at data from 2 different years instead of both for 2013 or 2014?
Well, part of it was that I did want to look at 2 different years. Part of it, though, was that I did the EBL data first. I actually had the EBL data probably 6 months before I had the eBrary data, and because of that, I had the 2013 data. And then when it was time to do the eBrary study, I just picked 2014 and thought I was going to do 2 years for each, and didn't really have the bandwidth to do it. So part of it was just I started with 2013 and then I moved to 2014 when I got the eBrary data. But part of it was that I really did want to do 2 different years, and I thought about doing 2 years for each. I thought about doing 2 years for eBrary and not doing EBL at all, or vice versa, but it seemed that it was worthwhile to do both of them. So a combination of factors.
Okay, here's another question for you.
Scott, there's a couple of people that are real interested, I think, in the suppliers that we are using at ProQuest. Do you mind if I pick up those questions and try to answer them? There's 3 or 4 of them kind of sitting there with that.
Yeah, pick up that one, and there's also the additional question of which suppliers are in negotiation.
Right, exactly. So this is in complete production today for both eBrary and EBL, and of course will continue with the new eBook Central platform. We are in development with Coots. I guess you're not surprised at that. We are in active discussions with Dawson, who is an eBook supplier in the United Kingdom, and we are in active discussion with EBSCO. We get eBook records for our knowledge base from EBSCO. We are still in discussion about how to actually make this automation process actually work. So we are really treating this as an open API, and we're trying to have discussions with as many providers as possible. And I'll tell you a little statistic of my own. I recently surveyed our largest 25 eBook customers at ProQuest. On average, they have 47 suppliers of eBook. We have to outreach. We have to reach out. We have to make this as just as possible and easy across as many suppliers as we possibly can.
Okay, I think that covered the 5 or 6 questions that were outstanding. Question for you, Michael. Have you looked into how restrictions on use, restrictions on number of pages you can print, copy, etc., may impact use and discipline?
I wish I could have. So I don't have, because the usage is aggregated across every library and every usage model. I don't really have a way to do that. So I would have loved to have, for instance, been able to look at usage of DDA titles versus usage of scribed titles versus usage of librarian purchase titles. I would have loved to have been able to look at titles with more or fewer restrictions, so SUPO titles versus MUPO titles, for instance, but I have none of that availability. So all I have is the usage at the broad title level across all of those models. So I think it's a great question, and I wish I could have looked at it, but didn't have a way to.
Okay, that was the last question that we have time for. Laura, do you have some final closing comments?
Great, and I'll just jump in here. This is Adam, your tech moderator again, and thank you so much everyone for joining us for today's session. As a reminder, the recording will be made available and you'll receive an email with a link on how to access that shortly. Also, you'll notice we've launched an evaluation link in the top left-hand corner of the screen, and we do hope that you'll take a quick moment to click on that and give us your feedback on today's session. Thank you once again, everyone. Take care and have a great day.